So good day everyone. In this lecture, I will discuss the criteria for evaluating a tax system and related measures. So from the Fundamentals of Public Budgeting and Finance by Aman Khan. So specifically, we will answer the following questions. Number one, what are the criteria for evaluating a tax system? And the number two, is there an optimal tax structure? So prepare your notebook and pen, and let's get started. So before we start evaluating a tax system, let me ask you first, why do we have taxes? So as the old saying goes, the two certain things in life is death and taxes. So as individual consumers, we pay taxes on our income, our goods and services, properties we own, and even inheritances we receive from our parents. So if we observe how the government collects taxes, it is not a cliche to say that if a government can find a way, it will. So in general, a tax is not a choice, but rather an involuntary payment to the government by an individual. So however, taxes are not evil. So let me ask you this. Would it be better if there is someone to protect, to defend, support, and provide your basic needs? Yes, of course. It is good to feel secured. So that someone is our government. So it protects our rights, promote rule of law, prepare for common defense, supports the economic system, and provide public services. So without our taxes, the government will not be able to do its work. No one will build roads, public transportation, provide public education, meaning no USEP. And worst, no one will protect us from local and foreign threats. So as the saying from the Marine Corps goes, you pay our salaries with taxes, but we repay it with our lives. All tax decisions, large or small, have a direct bearing on the economic well-being of the taxpayer and as well as the society at large. So this means that decision makers must carefully analyze and evaluate their choices before deciding what to tax, how much to tax, and who should ultimately bear the tax burden. So that is why it is of tantamount importance to look at some criteria to evaluate tax policies of a government. So I would like to call it FEFES, which stands for feasibility, flexibility, efficiency, feasibility, equity, and simplicity. All economies, in particular a market economy, go through periodic ups and downs, creating frequent revenue changes for a government. For example, with the pandemic, many business establishments chose to stop their operation while others decided to declare bankruptcy. So this means that the tax base from which a government collects and revenues must be flexible in order to meet the changing needs of the society. So in general, the more flexible a tax base via a tax system, the greater the ability of a government to generate the needed revenue from that base or system. So in principle, all taxes are flexible in the long run, but the degree of flexibility depends on the nature of tax, the condition of the economy, and the public's willingness to support any changes in tax system, in particular tax increase. So nevertheless, there are ways in a government can increase its revenue from existing tax base or system. So the government can expand its tax base, raise taxes, and find new source of revenue. So by definition, efficiency is primarily concerned with greatest production at a minimum cost. So in tax parlance, a tax system will be efficient if it produces a maximum revenue for a government without imposing an excess burden on taxpayers, such that it does not affect their ability to consume, save, or invest. So if it does, then it will produce a welfare loss not only to the individual taxpayers but also to society as a whole. So welfare loss occurs when the tax policy of a government causes a consumer via taxpayer to change his behavior by consuming less or producer by producing less to avoid tax burden than what is socially desirable. So to give an example of how a tax decision creates an excess burden, suppose that a government imposes a new tax on a commodity, say gasoline. So by 3 pesos. So let us assume that the price of the gasoline before the tax is 47 pesos. So given a choice, most firms would prefer to shift the entire tax burden on the consumers. But for the sake of discussion, let's assume that they cannot shift the burden to the consumer or supplier. So hence, the owner of the gasoline station will lower the purchase quantity from the supplier. So by moving the supply curve upward, so this will cause an increase in price. So because of the intense competition of the neighboring, let's say, gas stations, so let us assume that 2 pesos can be forwarded to the gasoline price, making the market price of 49 pesos. So since the tax increase is 3 pesos, hence the remaining 1 peso will be deducted from the net of the gasoline station. So this is the excess burden both firms and the consumer will have to absorb respectively. So from the after tax loss to the firms or not being able to shift the entire tax increase to the consumers from after tax increase in price. So David Hyman provides a simple expression for measuring the efficiency of loss or excess burden of a tax for each dollar of tax revenue. So he calls it the efficiency loss ratio of a tax. So it is obtained by dividing the excess burden of tax revenue by the total revenue, and it is given by the expression efficiency loss ratio ELR is equal to the excess burden divided by the tax revenue. So for instance, an efficiency of 0.25 would mean that for each peso of tax revenue raised a year, so the excess burden will be 25 cents. So since the goal of any tax decision is to ensure that it is not to create excess burden on the taxpayers or produce as little as possible without lowering the tax revenue. So estimating the efficiency loss ratio from various tax measures can produce useful information for the government to help achieve that goal. So feasibility. In a democratic system, all decisions, including those government taxes, have to go through a political process where they must have support of the public. So public support is necessary for the government to pass legislations on major tax decisions. So for instance, if a government wants to introduce a new tax, so be it a state income tax or a local option sales tax, it has to have approval of the voting public. So the process often requires that the initiatives go through a public referendum before the legislature can act on them. So this has two immediate implications for a tax policy. Number one, so it gives the public an opportunity to carefully evaluate the proposed policy before voting on it. And number two, it allows the decision makers to recognize the choices made by the public and to ensure that the policy reflects those choices. So, while earning public trust in general is not easy in a democratic society, it is much harder when it comes to taxes. So, a study by Martin Doughton on 2001 suggests three principal means a government can use to create or build public trust. So, especially with regard to taxes. So, number one, by assuring the taxpayers that their tax dollars or peso will not be misused or wasted. So, in order to ensure this, the government must have a sustained program of expenditure control. So, second, by bringing about the administrative reforms designed to control political pressure for higher spending. So, number three, by creating a philosophy of balance and fairness in a tax system which can be achieved through gradual change in the political culture, especially among those who are directly involved in everyday tax decisions. So none of these tasks are easy for any government and may take long time to earn public trust. But in the end, it is the best interest of the government to have an informed and engaging public when making decisions that will affect their collective welfare. So equity or fairness, as the term commonly used, is concerned with relative distribution of resources among individuals and groups according to some established notions of fairness and justice. So most general discussions of a tax system begin with the assumption that it is unfair. But it's not quite simple to say what is fair or not fair. Much depends on how the burden is distributed among the various income brackets under different tax alternatives. So there are two basic concepts of equity that economists and policymakers use to deal with fairness issue. So the horizontal and vertical. So horizontal equity is concerned with the treatment of individual with equal income, while vertical equity is concerned with the treatment of individual with unequal incomes. So since much of the problem in taxation revolves around to deal with individuals with an equal income, economists and policymakers are mostly concerned with vertical rather than horizontal equity. So lastly, a tax system must be based on laws and procedures that are easy to understand by the taxpayers and also easy to enforce by the administration at the lowest cost. So that is simplicity. So tax decisions are often complex than any other decisions of government a government makes, in part because of the process has to go through, especially political process, and in part because effect it has the effect it has to do on the taxpayer as well as the society at large. Yet, without taxes, there will be no government, no provision of public goods, and no improvement in collective welfare. Therefore, one needs to ask if there is an optimal vis-a-vis the best tax system, one that will generate maximum revenue for a government and will produce the least burden on taxpayers. So unfortunately, it is difficult to have a tax system that will fully satisfy all the stakeholders equally at the same time. So theoretically, if one could have a tax system that would meet all the criteria and also produce the maximum revenue for the government, it would be possible to achieve some measure of optimality. But in reality, it is much more complex than that. Economic and political realities often make it difficult to have a tax system that will fully meet those criteria. So, however, one can argue that when a tax system is less than optimal, it is still possible to achieve some degrees of optimality. A good example is the theory of second best, which allows the achievement of the second best optimality when some of the conditions of the first best optimality are violated. So one could also argue that if some distortions or inefficiency in tax system are unavoidable, it may be prudent to have a single tax, such as a lump sum tax, instead of multiple different taxes to keep the structure simple and distortion less. Theoretically, it would make sense only if we had all we all had identical incomes or preferences, or and our collective needs we keep low, so that the government can institute a uniform lump sum tax on all the taxpayers to keep the deadweight loss to a society to a minimum. But in reality, it will be difficult to have such a system because of our varying needs, incomes, and preferences, which may partly explain why it is necessary to have a tax system that better reflects the economic and political structure of a society, consistent with its value preference. Okay? So if you have some questions or clarifications, please comment down below and I will try to answer your questions as soon as I can. So good luck and God bless.